Support for Homebrewed Christianity comes from Emory University's Candler School of Theology, offering 16 graduate degrees, including a Master of Divinity, with a focus on justice, peace building, and conflict transformation, plus a new program in chaplaincy ministries. 100% of the Master of Divinity students receive scholarships covering at least 50% of tuition, plus full tuition for all certified candidates for ordination in the United Methodist Church. You hear that? You MCers? With a degree from Candler, you'll be ready to serve wherever God leads. Details at candler.emory.edu/homebrew-podcast. Yeah, you want to go to the Homebrew-podcast so they know that I told you about it. So check it out. Candler.emory.edu/homebrew-podcast. There'll be links on the website. Thank you, Candler. What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since 2008, I've been bringing you ideological ingredients right into your earbuds. So, you could nerd out, you could geek out, and do some thinking while you're doing those dishes. Maybe exercising, stuck in traffic, riding on a bus, who knows? But today, for your earbuds, is a return visit from Oliver Crisp. That's right, Oliver's back on. Every so often, I have to bring Mr. Oliver on the podcast. Why? Why is it? Because he is both a Calvinist and an analytic theologian. And if Homebrewed Christianity is anything, we try to be open and affirming and embracing of multiplicity and difference. And theoretically, a Reformed analytic theologian is quite far from my own position. But as you'll hear, I think we agreed too much. I'm worried this episode is going to sound like we were having a generative and fruitful conversation. We were both energized and going back and forth, and it's going to ruin my reputation. That's why, before we even get to this episode, Oliver Crisp, famous analytic theologian, has just moved back to Scotland like myself, but he's at St. Andrews, and I'm here in Edinburgh. But here's the thing. We were hanging out when we recorded this in Pasadena as part of a summer workshop called TheoPsych. We were hanging out with our friends at the Star office at Fuller Theological Seminary. Shout outs. And we had this fun interview, and it was a blast. We talked about anthropology, the relationship of religion and science. We started talking about his newest book, Analyzing Doctrine, which is setting up for how he's thinking of doing a systematic theology. And so, I hope you enjoy the conversation. It was fun. Before we get in to the interview and a few little announcements, I just wanted to tell you all a rule for Homebrewed Christianity, right? If you're going to be Reformed, Calvinist type theologian, or if you're going to get analytic and such, right? And I'm not suggesting you do that, but I know there's certain people that just love John Calvin so much, and they're like, look, Trip, I'm much more conservative than you. I'm a conservative evangelical in the Reformed tradition. I love John Calvin, and I say to that, if you're going to do it, you should keep it crispy. That's right. Hashtag keep it crispy. That is, I really think, a solid suggestion. And when you hear this conversation with Oliver, you'll hear like, wow, that's really good, especially for a Calvinist analytic theologian. All right. Anyway, I had fun hanging out with him when we were hanging out there at the TheoPsych gathering, and hope you enjoy it. Now, before we jump in, a few things. I want to give major shout-outs to the brand new members of the Homebrewed Christianity community, like Sam Jacobs, John Buck, Corey Moore, Jacqueline Speicher. I don't know how to pronounce that, but holler back at me, Jacqueline, and let me know if I pronounced it correctly. Mark Hampton and Jay Eastman. All of y'all, thank you so much. You're brand new members of the Homebrewed Christianity community, and they don't have to be alone. You can join too. And you can find out what it's like to get the private Homebrewed Christianity podcast feed for all the community members. You can join the Facebook group and interact and all that kind of exciting goodness. And you'll find that this December, in that feed, is a 5-lecture introduction to the Hebrew Bible by Walter Brueggemann. That's right. And you'll get to hear my back and forth with him about coming up. We have 2 exciting classes. Number 1, over the liturgical season of Epiphany, which correlates more or less to the beginning of 2020. We have a pop-up community exploring the Enneagram, because members asked. I'm an Enneagram skeptic, but we're going to be investigating the Enneagram. Maybe I'll come around. I've been told I'm either a 7 or an 8, and the other one's probably my wing, but I'll find out. And also, on the other part of the class, I'll be working with Sarah Lane Ritchie, looking at spiritual technologies, learning about them, and then working with them so that you can come home spiritually and maybe into a new place. Then, this is super duper exciting, I'm going to be working with John freaking Cobb, JC himself, John Cobb, to do an online seminar in Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. That's right. Boom shakalaka. Oh, that's so exciting. So, if you want to get the Walter Brueggemann class, you want to be a part of both of these, the easiest thing to do is just to become a member of the Homebrewed community. And then you'll get all the info popping right up in that private podcast feed. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun in the next few months at Homebrewed Christianity. And I really appreciate everyone's support. Now, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Oliver Crisp, and I hope you keep it crispy. Hello, everybody. This is Tripp. I'm here with Oliver Crisp. We're hanging out in Pasadena for the TheoPsych conference, or it's not technically a conference. What?
Kind of a workshop.
Yeah.
You know, people hang out and talk about these things.
A 2-week exploration of creation.
That's good. That's very Gene Roddenberry, an exploration into the deep space.
I know, but it's part of a, connecting theology, philosophy, science, and such, and our focus this time is on anthropology, theological anthropology. So when they introduced you yesterday as a theological safety puppy, and for those of you that don't live in Los Angeles, there's a certain percentage, depending on the culture of your town, who require the presence of a small dog to cope with ontic shock, and it's like a security animal. And we're going to be dealing with cognitive science of religion and things. So you're like the theological security animal for everyone here. And
yeah, I feel like I should have one of those bibs that they put on the guide dogs and these kinds of animals to tell everyone else what my role is, but we haven't got one.
No, well, so when you're thinking of theological anthropology and in the tradition itself, what are the key concepts, intuitions that you don't want us to forget when engaging in kind of contemporary psychological research and such?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess one of the fundamental things is one of the themes that we're supposed to be looking at these next 2 weeks, which has to do with being made in the image of God and what that entails. And that raises all sorts of important questions for us moderns, I suppose, about human uniqueness in the universe and across species. And is there such thing as human uniqueness? How do we cash that out if there is? Does it make us entities that have some special relationship to God and those sorts of things? How might we image God? And how might the psychological sciences help theologians and philosophers think about that? So I think that's the focus of these 2 weeks. And I think that's also a fundamental theological, anthropological issue. That also feeds into other what I think of as fundamental theological themes there as well. For example, the theme of salvation, because of course Christians want to say that it's by means of a human being, not a mere human being, but a human being that human salvation comes about in the person of Christ. So what we say about human beings is relevant to what we say about who Christ is, and so therefore it's relevant to what we say about the incarnation and salvation and the atonement. And so I think there's all sorts of important ways in which what we say about human beings touches on really fundamental theological issues that have a kind of broad ripple effect across other kind of theological topics.
Mm-hmm. And when you're thinking of theological anthropology and engaging the science stuff, one of the, it seems to me, even in the way you hinted at the image of God having that Christological connection, anthropology is one of those doctrines that has a whole lot of connections to whatever the theologian centering doctrine is. Right. And so like in your Christology that we talked about last time you were on the podcast, which everyone should go listen to, obviously, you have a very strong affirmation of the image of God in Christ having God's divine affirmation of our own humanity. Right. So the incarnation is a divine statement about the dignity of humanity.
Right.
Which, then I was like surprised because I just thought you were a Calvinist. So maybe you can kind of unpack the way in which you see your Christology shaping, kind of those base intuitions when you get to themes in anthropology.
Yeah, good. So, for me, Christology does a lot of heavy lifting, theologically speaking. And, that's true of my early work in kind of Christology stuff and on the atonement. It's true of my more recent work where I'm trying to begin to make steps towards doing something more synthetic, bringing doctrines together into a more systematic whole. Mm-hmm. And in that respect, I guess I've been deeply influenced by both some of the early church fathers, people like Athanasius and Irenaeus and others, as well as more recent thinkers like Cathy Tanner and Tom Torrance and, of course, Karl Barth. But it seems to me that how we think about what we are as human beings and this question of what makes us unique or what makes us special, what puts us in relationship with our Creator, depends in fundamental ways in Christian theology upon what we say with respect to Christ. And I have come to the view over the course of time, it didn't start off at this place, but I've come to the view over the course of time, that the incarnation isn't just God's rescue plan for fallen humanity, but that the incarnation is, in some sense, necessary for a world in which God creates creatures like you and I that he wants to be united with and wants to be in loving fellowship with. Mm-hmm. And so, in order for that union with God to happen, irrespective of human sin, it seems to me, a fitting way of bringing that about is by means of having what I've sometimes called a kind of hub between divinity and humanity. Like you have a hub that you hook up your PC to, a kind of wireless hub, so that our human natures can be, as it were, hooked up to the human nature of Christ, who, as the hub between divinity and humanity, is kind of hardwired into the Godhead and is able to pick up the radio signals and connect us up to God through his human nature. So it seems to me that the incarnation is something which is really important, independent of questions of human salvation, in order for us to be in right relationship with God, because we couldn't kind of like metaphysically bootstrap ourselves into a position where we could be in this kind of united, this strongly united sense of being in the presence of God without Christ.
In the word strong, there is that kind of picking up on like Tanner's differentiation between kind of weak and strong participation.
Yeah, to some extent, absolutely. And again, one of the things that's changed for me over the last, I suppose, 15 years is I've come to think that some doctrine of theosis, which often, theosis is the notion of divinization, or the idea that somehow we're on a trajectory into God, so to speak, forevermore, becoming more like God, never being lost in God, never becoming like a drop of water that goes into the ocean is lost, but rather being ever more closely united to God. And that kind of doctrine is often associated with, Eastern theology, patristic theology. What's interesting, one interesting thing anyway, in recent systematic and historical theology is how theologians have begun to find this elsewhere in Western theologians. And it's almost as if you can't look at any Western theologian at the moment and without finding, oh, it turns out they had something like a doctrine of theosis. And then you've got interesting stuff being done by people in New Testament studies in particular, on Pauline theology, saying, hey, this stuff about union with Christ and participation that you find, these tropes in Paul's theology, maybe we shouldn't think of them as mere tropes or metaphors. Maybe he meant this with metaphysical seriousness, that we really are united and participating in the life of Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit. So a lot of that has kind of fed into my thinking and made me think, wow, if we take these different sorts of literatures seriously, then maybe that should transform how we think about both our humanity in relation to Christ and Christ's humanity in relation to his divinity, and how those two things are related, how my humanity is related to Christ and how Christ enables us to, as it were, interface with divinity.
And so theosis is both like a promissory note of grace for the individual and for creation itself.
Absolutely. I think that's right. I think there's a sense in which it has both of those things. There's our participation in the life of God, and there's the promise of the creation's participation in the life of God in some sense as well.
And in mentioning like coming out of recent Pauline study, I think if at least growing up, sometimes the communal or creation's wide vision of it would get dismissed because we were still seeing it from the individual sinner's perspective, and what is a sinner required to do in response to God or whatever.
Right.
And one of the things in the Pauline study is that the incarnation becomes more revelatory of the actual nature and character of God, because it's about God's divine initiative of grace upon grace for creation itself.
Right, absolutely. I think that's really important. It seems to me this divine initiative is what brings us into this, or gives us the prospect of this kind of strongly unitive relationship with God, that it's all from a Godward perspective, that God set the creation up in such a way that, and that Christ is this hub between divinity and humanity, and he set the creation up in such a way that the expectation is human beings, through the work of Christ, as a consequence of the fall, are able to enjoy this participation in God, and a participation that will become ever more intimate the longer we enjoy it, so to speak. I mean, in that respect, my thinking's been influenced by the 18th century New England theologian Jonathan Edwards, who had this idea that this participation in the divine life doesn't stop at the grave, and therefore thereafter we're sort of like in this perfected state, but rather it's a trajectory into God that goes on forevermore. Yeah,
and the Orthodox, like Gregory of Nyssa, talks about that as well. So it's definitely I think there are certain assumptions, at least in American evangelicalism, that at whatever point you reach the age of accountability until the time you die is like your play space,
right?
And that's like where you really get to. That's where you got to figure that faith stuff out. It like one of the things of learning the larger tradition is to realize how many assumptions we think are just normal for just basic Christianity are really tied to a certain type of American entrepreneurially shaped like narrow that response time. Yeah, always need no sale lasts forever.
Absolutely. No, that is so true. It is so true that cultural assumptions and American cultural assumptions do frame these things in important respects. And we all have a kind of cultural myopia, I suppose, short-sightedness, and you need to be in conversation. I mean, this is one reason to be in conversation with, what my wife calls my dead friends, my dead theological friends. You're in conversation with this great cloud of witnesses who help correct the kind of cultural myopia that we have, help us to see that a lot of what we assume are blinkers that we need to have removed in order to reconsider certain things that we thought were closed or were sorted out, and that we need to be problematized in certain ways, in a way that's creative and helpful.
So when you think of humanity and its connection to larger creation and nature itself, how do you understand that older tradition in light of humanity's being the fruit of nature and creation and emerging and evolving out of this much larger history than we were initially aware of in the life of the church when thinking about the human?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've given less thought to that at present, but I think an adequate way of thinking about human beings in relation to God and in relation to the wider created order these days has to take seriously the development in theology and related disciplines, which is making it impossible to ignore the fact that we have very close relationships with other species on this planet, with the planet itself, and that we're in very important ways symbiotically related to the environment in which we live and in which we thrive. And so my own account thus far is trying to sort of paint a picture of the place of humankind in the created order, which is consistent with a broadly sort of evolutionary account of how we've got here. Mm-hmm. But there's much more to be said on the topic of, for example, how do we think of the uniqueness of human beings in relation to other early humans or mm-hmm. human-like species?
Well, we took all them out.
Right, exactly. Or but at what point do you have the image of God? Right. Do Neanderthals have the image of God? Is it Homo erectus that has the image of God? Is it only Homo sapiens that have the image of God? Do we extend the image of God to other non-human entities? Did dolphins have the image of God? Do certain sorts of simian lives have the image of God, and so on?
And we'll end up having that question technologically. Like, right. If you pass the Turing test with AI.
Right. Yes, exactly. You just transpose it into different matter, a kind of digital base rather than a kind of a soggy grey matter base. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So I think there are all sorts of important questions which theologians are beginning to address in terms of our relationship to the created order and other species, which bears closer scrutiny. And thankfully, there are theologians like David Clough and Andrew Lindsay and others who are taking up that baton and running with it. It's something I've done less with, but it's something that I see the need to explore further. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, so when thinking about talking to you about it, one of the things that I remember us discussing last time, and is connected to that divine initiative part, right? Like, all right, our desk just moved. I have no idea how it did, but we're in a very fancy sound studio here at Fuller, and there's lots of contraptions around, and the desk move. Is if you think of with like the categories of a logos Christology, like a lot of the Cappadocians do, then they use the logos to unpack the principle of reason in creation itself, and the possibility or potential within that creation to respond to God.
Right. And
when you get to Christ as logos made sarx, you get in the Gospel of John, the sarx bit is helpful because it's not just made human; it's made sarx, like that which all materiality is constitutive of.
Right.
And so I wonder if there's, if we think of our position anthropologically as a responsive one responding to the divine initiative, then the story of emerging, growing complexity with the potential of response that you see perfected in Jesus's fidelity to the one he called Abba, then the story of evolution and the growth of subjectivity and community is actually the story of the wording until the word can be received and mirrored back in the faithfulness of the Father to the Son, or the Son to the Father.
Yeah.
Something like. Anyway, that's what I was.
No. I like very much what you're saying there. I've also wondered recently. Again, it's just the beginnings of a kind of wondering whether there may be ways in which, in the world to come, we see not just human beings on this journey into God and developmentally on a journey into God, but that being mirrored in the created order itself. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking along the lines of something like a Lewisian, C.S. Lewisian sort of Narnian way of thinking about the cosmos, where you've got talking beasts and you've got some who don't talk but some who do at various sorts of stages of development. There are some philosophers, Christian philosophers recently, who've like Trent Doherty, who've speculated that maybe some creatures in the world to come will be on a kind of developmental trajectory that in some sense echoes the human developmental trajectory, and we may end up with animal persons, non-human animal persons of some sort, a bit like Narnian animals. Now, I don't know what to make of that, but I mean, like the idea.
If we could do space travel, we might have the question now, right?
Right. That's true.
And I found that to be helpful, because a lot of times we're asking these questions, but we only know one story of the emergence of life and the possibility for genuine, conscious, symbolic, mythopoetic relation to the transcendent.
Yeah.
But there may be like 20,000 planets who have that experience and encounter. And that's why I find like the notion of participation, divine initiative, something like the Logos, or things like that, to be more helpful in anticipating those questions, because it enables you to say the unique, particular, strong affirmations you get confessionally as a Christian, but also have some type of connection point for interpreting and understanding other trajectories from other, say, like another species on another planet, or whatever.
Yeah, no, I totally resonate with that. I think that's, I think it makes a lot of sense not to have kind of theological hostages to fortune when it comes to these wider questions that we're beginning to become more aware of with advances in technology, and as we start to scan the heavens and see deeper into space and contemplate, interstellar travel and stuff like that, or at least interplanetary travel. That those sorts of questions are obviously going to be on the horizon, and I think it's worthwhile thinking carefully about them. I've tried to think about them in terms of issues of things like multiple incarnations and so on. But I mean, I think there's also kind of ways in which one might approach it, thinking along those sorts of lines. In what way would our theological models make sense were we to contemplate life on other planets and what that might look like?
Well, so one of the areas that kind of pops up in my head has been, for much of the 20th century, Karl Rahner's kind of connection between the immanent and economic trinity has existed. And a lot of the extraterrestrial stuff sets up for people resisting it. And when Keith Ward was on the podcast, I don't remember, a couple years ago, he told a story about going to a museum in Amsterdam and going through this cathedral, and they don't know that it's Keith Ward. So they're giving him the tour, and they're like, this is a big picture of the Trinity. You got the Father, the Son, and the Holy Pigeon. And so he uses as an example of going like, of the experience of God within the Christian tradition can be definitional without collapsing the immanent and economic trinity, because you may have a planet where the people have loving relationships with the God we know in Christ that don't have two gendered reproduction, right, and winged fowl, right, which but him saying it with his accent makes it all the better. But it to me, like a lot of the questions that come up in science and religion conversations and things, some people experience them as threats, and others like, that's such a weird way of asking a question, right, that no one gets burned for heresy when you think about extraterrestrials. Right. But if we're just going to talk about the Trinity immediately, that's, that can get you.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think it's important to try and think constructively and creatively with the right sort of connection to the traditions and so on, but constructively and creatively about these bigger issues. And I'm glad to say that I think that conversation is beginning to be had, and I think there's a lot more work to be done on it.
So in your new book, you said that you're kind of turning from individual investigations of different doctrines and things, and thinking about what does a larger constructive theological proposal look like, and you might be daring yourself to do a systematic theology. So in that process, like, what were you hoping to do when you started, right, and what did you end up doing when you got done? Oh, and name the book for everyone that's sitting
so
there.
the most recent book is called Analyzing Doctrine Toward a Systematic Theology, which is maybe a slightly overblown title, but I mean, it's a kind of stepping stone project. You're absolutely right. I mean, in a way, I started doing something a little bit more tentatively synthetic in the Word Enfleshed book, which I think we've talked about before. Which was trying to bring together aspects of the incarnation, the atonement together to think about what does human salvation mean. For me, that was an important book because it was a first attempt to step outside of one particular doctrine and try and bring several doctrines together to say something about a broader picture about human salvation in relation to God. Here, I'm taking yet another further step on another stepping stone that may end up taking me towards a larger project. And I thought, well, it would be interesting to try and think synthetically about the doctrine of God, what we want to say about God, what we want to say about God's intentions in creation in relation to the incarnation and salvation. I mean, even just that little cluster of doctrines there, which doesn't comprise the whole of systematic theology, is nevertheless, it's a big canvas, right? And you have to keep a lot of conceptual balls in the air when you're trying to do something more constructive, and so it's more demanding. And so I thought, well, let's try that sort of a stepping stone project and see where we get with that. There's all sorts of other things, you know, if one were to do a more comprehensive piece of work that one would have to take seriously, like what do you say about the church? What do you say about the sacraments? What do you say about liturgy? What do you say about the nature of things like justification, regeneration, and the order of salvation, things like that? So there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't appear in the book, and certainly some reviewers were like, why haven't you talked about this? Well, the reason I didn't talk about that was because this is a stepping stone project, is a sort of way of dipping my toe in the water to mix my metaphors and see what it looks like to do that kind of work. And I must say, I've enjoyed doing it very much, but I've also found that it's been much more conceptually demanding and takes longer to get answers to. So, I mean, I'm hoping that I'll be able to move further in that direction, maybe ultimately writing something more systematic. But in order to do so, all sorts of other things have got to go on first in terms of thinking about the shape of such a project and the kind of nodal issues that are kind of fundamental underlying principles that organize the whole, those sorts of things.
So one time when I interviewed Moltmann and said, you know, you did these series of explorations around doctrines, you never wrote a systematic theology. And but Pannenberg did. And he said, well, it takes a certain personality to think they could write a systematic theology. And I just thought, well, one, that's funny, thinking of their relationship, but also like I do think there's something different because like most of your other books have like used the conversation within the tradition and the way it's being framed again now to wrestle with a particular doctrine where there's like new resources, insight, and energy that's coming up. But that synthetic process where you're starting to, you know, draw the threads in your own work and creativity and connect it to the tradition. What did that feel like? I don't even have any idea what that feel like. I have,
it was kind of exciting. Rather than feeling like I was closing things off, it felt like making the connections, open things out in perhaps unexpected ways. And it made me think, wow, that maybe there is room to think further about some of these things and to take this to the next step. But it was kind of exciting in a way because maybe it's a bit like writing a novel. I mean, I've never written a novel, although of course one can dream. I always think that writing a novel is one of those great sort of creative works where you're creating a whole world from scratch, and it's got to be an inhabitable world. It's got to be one that you can suspend disbelief and get through as a reader and so on. I mean, a systematic theologian isn't doing quite that, but they are world building, right? And you've got to build a world. You've got to construct a world of doctrine that people can inhabit and can, you know, they're not exactly suspending disbelief in inhabiting it, but they're seeking to get inside that structure and make it their own in some sense. Trying to do that is a much more kind of creative project, I think, than perhaps I had hitherto thought. I mean, I think, and maybe that just depends on the systematic theology you read, right? I mean, I remember years ago reading Louis Berkhoff, which is, I really enjoy reading Louis Berkhoff, but it's kind of like dehydrated theology. Do you know what I mean? You have to add a liquid.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to write theology of the dehydrated variety, but I think there are ways in which one can look at key voices in the tradition who've done really creative theological projects and ask the question, what is it about this kind of world building? What is it about the world of doctrine that they've constructed that I particularly find appealing, want to inhabit? What are the key moves that they've made? What's the overarching sort of leitmotifs or principles or themes that run through the work? Why is this so compelling? Those sorts of questions seem to me to be questions that are really pressing for systematic theology. And I found that is a much more creative process than I had previously thought, which has been very exciting.
In one of the things I found about at least the systematic theologies that I find significantly more interesting than the others, at least in contemporary ones, are ones where their prolegomena doesn't solve the big issues that philosophers and scientists and such bring to the Christian theologian. So ones in which those questions are preserved while doing the constructive and creative task. Yeah,
I'm with you there. I mean, I have begun to think a bit more about, what would the shape of a theology that I'm interested in writing be? What would it look like? And one thing that I'm very committed to is not getting stuck in prolegomena, or maybe even writing something with prolegomena. I mean, I'm much more interested, like you're suggesting, in the sorts of theological projects where the writer leaps immediately into the task, and you're just thrown in the deep end, and you sink or swim, sort of thing. And the kind of theological voices that I've really resonated with over the years have been those sorts of voices. People like some of the voices I've already mentioned, Irenaeus or Athanasius or Augustine to some extent, or Anselm. I mean, I'm a big fan of Anselm, or even someone like Calvin. People think of the Institutes of the Christian Religion as some great system of Christian doctrine. But when you start reading the Institutes, it doesn't read like a contemporary systematic theology. He doesn't start off with prolegomena. He doesn't even have a long section talking about the divine attributes. There are all sorts of things that you would expect in a kind of standard textbook of Christian theology that Calvin doesn't actually provide for you. And I like that. I like those sorts of approaches to Christian doctrine that simply say, we're going to talk about the faith, or the faith as I conceive it. And you just get straight into it.
So one of the questions that I'm sure is going to come up during this is the nature of religion, as understood in psychological science and such, and then how we understand that religion, connecting our anthropology, like, are human beings innately religious? Are we giant idol factories? Are we open but not perfected in a sense? Like, how do you see that how would you frame the question of the scientific account of religion, and then the question of religion in systematic theology, where, in contemporary context, if you're more Bardian, then religion's like a negative category for Auerbach style, but if you're, like someone, like Rahner, you're going to be using religion to connect to kind of more of the transcendental existential type of move. And
right. I think much depends on what you take religion to be and how you freight that. I mean, it's a sort of fraught concept that has different sorts of valences depending on the literature or the conversations that you're involved with. And that will be true of different sort of theological approaches and methods. You've already outlined several, the Barthian, the kind of Rahnerian, and there are others. Similarly, in terms of the way that religion is thought about in sort of the religion science dialogue, or in terms of those who are interested in kind of the more philosophical aspect of science and how that relates to religious questions. For my own part, I don't think of religion as necessarily a bad thing, but I do think of human beings as kind of, in some sense, innately religious. Perhaps we are idol factories, as Calvin would claim. But I'm very much drawn to that aspect of Calvin's vision where he talks about this kind of seed of religion or sense of the divine, I remember years ago reading as an undergraduate Calvin's Institutes. I wasn't brought up as a Calvinist, but I was reading Calvin's Institutes for a class and reading the first 5 sections of book 1 of the Institutes, which talk about this idea of this innate sense of the divine, and immediately thinking, I've always thought that's true. I just never had the concepts to articulate that. And then having a second similar sort of experience years later as a graduate student, reading the early stuff on Reformed epistemology by Al Plantinga and Nick Wolterstorff, who were taking that kind of idea and replanting it in a kind of philosophical soil, and thinking, I've always kind of thought that we don't have to have arguments for the existence of God, that something about belief in God can be a sort of basic belief that lies at the foundations of everything else. And that, we just have this sense that there's a divine. We can't help but believe it. It's incorrigible, like all sorts of other beliefs that we have. So, I'm sympathetic to the idea that there's something about religion that's hardwired into us. And to the extent that you have people in sort of cognitive science and religion who are beginning to approach the question in a similar way, and Justin Barrett's one of those people, I think you've got the potential for a fruitful dialogue about, well, what is it that is hard? If there is something hardwired into human beings, if we are inherently religious in some sense, what is that? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it something that can be misdirected? Can it be rightly directed? How does that relate to broader questions of theological method that litter the modern theological landscape? And of course, there's a whole literature on, how we think about these things, from the kind of debate between Barton and Brunner in the 1930s through to, stuff in post-Vatican theology and so on. So, I think there's interesting material for a useful and fruitful discussion there. I'm not about to write off the concept of religion or cede the concept of religion to the naysayers. I think there's potential for it to have an important place in how we think theologically about these things.
And there's one of the things I found helpful with the cognitive science stuff is you actually have an example of a very specific phenomena that's part of the human being, that the way you interpret it is really connected to your much larger metaphysical or theological commitments than what the data says. Right? Like you could get a militant atheist in Justin, and if you talked about the cognitive mechanisms that make us born theists, they're going to be like, yep, exactly. And then one of them's going to be like, well, now I've explained that phenomena away. There's no God. And Justin's going to be like, no, don't you think that's how it works? We actually think that human beings are created in the image of God to participate eschatologically in the divine life. And yet there's this transition and this growth process that you have to move into. And so you would expect there to be cognitive mechanisms that anticipate this, but are not perfected yet. And if I was designing that over a period of time, it might look something like this, but the science hasn't changed, but the framework in which it is set, did.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And we've already been discussing today in the sessions about how things can be theoretically underdetermined in important respects, and you have to fill in the blanks. That is true in theology, and it's true, as you say, in some of these discussions in things like cog-sci, where people are coming with the same data. They're drawing certain conclusions on the basis of that data, and then they're taking a further step, and that further step is going in one of several different directions. I think that's true also of the way that Christian doctrine is often practiced, that we have certain sorts of data that we appeal to as Christian theologians, usually sources of theological authority, whether that's a particular theologian or it's a creed or it's a confession or it's scripture. We tend to, interact with these different sources of authority differently. But we're making appeals to these sources of authority in order to make judgments. Nevertheless, usually those sources of authority are in some important sense theoretically underdetermined, and we have to go beyond what they say in order to say something constructive and say something that's more complete, theologically speaking. So I welcome that. I think there's a possible way in which there's consonance between the sort of stuff we're talking about in terms of, say, cognitive science on that particular topic, and the way in which Christian theologians build models, doctrinal models, in order to make sense of central Christian doctrines like the Incarnation or the Atonement or whatever it might be, Trinity.
It's one of the things that I try to communicate in systematic class is that every good theologian lapses into doxology somewhere in their systematic. They just don't know where. Right. But like that's what happens, right? Like you're trying to give the most beautiful and accurate account, but it's also an account of an experience that you can't even fully articulate to yourself what it's like to be redeemed.
Right.
So, and yet you're sharing something in common with the people you worship with. And then you have these practices that go back to a whole bunch of people you may not even share that much in common with, but you share these practices with. But there is that you lapse into doxology doesn't mean you have to quit talking.
Right.
And I think there's a certain fear in a lot of Christians that science is a reason you stop talking. And it's like a conversation stopper about God, when what we talk about when we talk about God as Christians is something that if it doesn't provoke doxology, you haven't done it right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's as important in terms of the task of doing theology to know when to stop talking about theological construction and doctrinal models and things like that, and when to move from those kinds of normative claims to the kinds of doxological claims that you're talking about. I think that's as important as knowing where those boundaries lie as the task of trying to give a right account of Christian doctrine is. And you see that, in Pauline theology. I mean, there's numerous places where Paul starts talking about something that gets carried away and ends up in doxology. So it's an ancient practice. It's an apostolic practice. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. And I think, in fact, it's a sign of a healthy approach to theology if the kind of theology that you do not so much lapses into doxology, but eventually yields doxology, right? There's got to be a point at which we move beyond the propositional to the doxological.
Well, it's sometimes when you're trying to get students to do their own constructive work. I say that just because there's the actual practice of doxology, and then there's the letter your child writes you on Father's Day, and they're like, Oliver, you are the world's single greatest dad of all time. I love you. My favorite thing to do is to do this with you. Blah 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 blah. Right? And I said, I think the one Jesus calls Abba at some point when we're sitting there doing theology, we think this is the most sophisticated, most accurate thing of all time, and it's going to change the world. At some point, it's just really complicated, and maybe it's not even that right. And you probably know that every other kid calls their dad the greatest dad of all time, but that doesn't make it any less beautiful and coming from a place. And so, a lot of times I think Christians want to outsource the theology to a professional,
right?
Rather than there's a certain sheer joy of taking the time to sit and think and craft language and words to talk about the encounter with God in Christ.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. And I think you can see that, it's kind of enshrined in written liturgies that we've had handed down to us in various branches of the Christian church. And a lot of those liturgies, which I very much delight in, are full of replete with this kind of rich and deep and profound language of doxology, of praise, that's really deeply theological, but it also, at the same time, somehow, wonderfully, recognizes the limits of theological discourse and the need to go beyond that in the praise of God. I think that's wonderful. I think that's something that we should celebrate as theologians. I know in the kind of areas that I work in analytic theology, there's a recent liturgical turn. There's a recent turn in that literature to really take this work on liturgy and beginnings of work on the doctrine of the church in relation to liturgy much more seriously. And I think that's a really welcome development in a literature that's up until now been largely regarded as very, very cerebral and not very much engaged with the life of the church.
Mm-hmm. So you are about to move from California to St. Andrews. I
am.
And so after you're settled in things and you're getting the first reviews to your new book, what's on your horizon?
Well, I am, as you say, moving. It's a bittersweet thing. We've loved our 8 years in California. It's been absolutely wonderful. I've really treasured the time I've had here and the people that I've met and spent time with. We're going to new challenges, and I look forward to that very much. I am hoping that the Stepping Stone project that I've just done, the Analyzing Doctrine book, will take me to the next step of beginning to think about writing something of a systematic theology. And so in the next 5-10 years, I'm going to try and spend a lot of my time thinking about and hopefully writing some of that and beginning to see how that takes shape. I think that actually St. Andrews is a good place to try and think and do that kind of stuff, because there are a number of other people who will be helpful dialogue partners there in the Logos Institute, but also other colleagues, people like Christoph Schwerbel, who's a German theologian, the professor of divinity there, who's also engaged in a constructive project of his own. I'm hoping he'll be an interesting dialogue partner, and other people who work in kind of systematic and historical theology, like Steve Holmes, for example, or people who work in related disciplines who might also be useful foils. People like Judith Wolff, for example, who works in kind of more continental philosophical theology. So I'm hoping that place will help shape me in useful and good ways and help me take that next step in the way that I've been enabled to do here in California to get this far from where I was 8 years ago.
Cool. Well, thank you for hanging out.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.